2 in the morning. 8 men. 1 woman. They surrounded her in a dead mining yard with nothing but gravel, darkness, and absolute confidence in their numbers. Their leader raised a stun device and smiled. Last chance, sweetheart. Walk away while you still can. Mara Vale didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't even raise her voice. She just looked at him the way a storm looks at a window patient, inevitable, already decided. Last chance, she said quietly. For you. They had no idea what they had just woken up. If you're new here, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The bus dropped her at the front gate at 6:47 in the morning, 17 minutes ahead of the scheduled intake window. Most people would have waited in the vehicle, let the driver idle, finished their coffee, done anything to delay the moment of arrival at a place like Blackridge Tactical Academy, a compound that looked, from the outside, less like a training facility and more like something designed to remind you how small you were. Mara Vale stepped off before the wheels fully stopped. She stood at the gate with a worn duffel on one shoulder and a manila intake folder under her arm. Gray sky overhead, wind off the ridge that cut through fabric like it had a grudge. She studied the compound the way someone reads a room they've been in before, not like a tourist, not like a recruit. Like someone doing a quiet threat assessment and not particularly impressed by what she found. The gate guard checked her credentials twice. Intelligence contractor. Mid-level clearance. No prior combat posting. Vale Mara. Intel support. 3-week rotation. He read aloud, like he was confirming a dental appointment. That's right. He looked her over once. Civilian clothes. No rank. A woman somewhere in her mid-30s who carried herself like she was used to being underestimated and had long since stopped spending energy on it. He stamped the folder. Orientations at 0800 in Building C. Don't be late. I won't be. She walked through the gate and didn't look back. Blackridge sat in the high desert, 40 minutes from the nearest town with a real grocery store. The facility had been repurposed from an old federal training range, same bones, new skin. 6 operational buildings, a vehicle depot, 2 live fire ranges, a close-quarters battle house made of prefab concrete panels, and an outdoor pit that the instructors called the sandbox, but the trainees called something considerably less polite. The compound housed 62 active trainees during Mara's rotation. Special operations candidates, intelligence field officers who needed combat certification, 2 embedded analysts from agencies she wasn't supposed to ask about, and a rotating roster of instructors who treated the entire operation like a sustained experiment in controlled suffering. Mara had dealt with worse facilities. She'd trained in places that made Blackridge look like a resort. She wasn't supposed to remember that. The cover story was tight. Mid-level contractor. Soft background. 3 weeks of embedded observation for an intelligence methodology. Review the kind of bureaucratic assignment that sounded important enough to justify her presence, but vague enough that nobody would look too hard. She had the paperwork. She had the clearance level. She had 3 weeks to move through the compound without drawing attention. She was there for one reason, and it had nothing to do with the methodology review. She was there to find out if she was still herself. The orientation room held 22 people. Mara took a seat near the back left habit, not strategy, though the two had blurred together long ago. Good sight lines, 2 exits visible, nobody behind her. The instructor who ran orientation was a staff sergeant named Holt, 40-something. Built like someone had assembled him from surplus military parts and left him out in the weather for a decade. He had the particular posture of a man who had given this same briefing 200 times and had exactly 0 patience left for anyone who thought they were special. He ran through the schedule, training blocks, evaluation criteria, conduct standards, medical protocols. He did not make eye contact with Mara once. When he finished, he looked around the room with the flat assessment of a man counting inventory. Questions? Nobody spoke. Good, he picked up his folder. You've got 40 minutes before your first PT block. I suggest you use them to accept that the next 3 weeks are going to be worse than you think. He walked out. The room slowly exhaled. The man to Mara's left leaned over. He was young, early 20s, jaw like a shovel, the particular confidence of someone who had been the strongest person in every room he'd ever been in. Intel contractor, right? He said. I'm Reyes, special ops candidate, cycle 4. He said it like she should be impressed. Mara, they put you in Block C? That's right. He nodded slowly, looking at her duffel, her clothes, the total absence of anything tactical about her appearance. You do field work before, or mostly desk? Mara picked up her folder. Mostly desk, she said, and stood up. She had known it would be like this. She had prepared for it. That didn't make the first week any easier to move through. The compound had its own social architecture, the way any closed system does. At the top were the special ops candidates, men like Reyes, who moved through the facility with the easy authority of people who expected deference and generally got it. Below them, the field officers, competing for position in their own internal hierarchy. Below them, the support staff and analysts who kept their heads down and did their work and tried not to draw notice. Mara was supposed to fit in that last category. She did for about 48 hours. The trouble started with small things, the kind of friction that could be explained away as coincidence, if you were inclined to be charitable. Her bunk assignment was changed without notice, moving her from Block C to a corner unit in Block F, the building farthest from the main training areas, with a faulty heating duct that rattled through the night like something mechanical was slowly dying inside the wall. When she went to the supply room for her replacement kit, the boots listed on her intake form weren't available. The clerk, a young specialist named Dunner who couldn't quite meet her eyes, suggested she check back in a few days. She checked back in 2 days, still unavailable. She did the first morning PT block in her own gear and said nothing about it. By day 3, the attendance log showed her absent from a briefing she had attended. The discrepancy flagged on her record. The administrative sergeant who handled it shrugged. System error. Happens. Does it happen often? More than you'd think. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, all right, and let it go. She was building a picture. She'd been building it since the first morning, cataloging the interactions, the way you catalog terrain noting, elevations, choke points, likely avenues of approach. The friction wasn't random. It had a source, and the source had a logic. She just didn't know yet how far it was willing to go. By the end of the first week, she knew. The PT sessions were structured by block. Intel contractors weren't required to participate in the full combat training rotations. They could observe, take notes, stay on the periphery. Mara had been doing that, watching, keeping her performance deliberately unremarkable, running the morning routes at a pace that was competent but not conspicuous, hitting the required benchmarks without exceeding them. It was, she realized later, exactly the wrong strategy. Invisible had worked in other places. Here, invisible read as weakness. And weakness, in a place like Blackridge, drew attention the way blood draws things with teeth. On day 8, one of the senior instructors, a man named Instructor Briggs, thick through the shoulders, with the particular contempt of someone who had never lost a fight he'd started, stopped her after morning formation. Vale. She stopped, turned. Intel rotation, right? Yes. He looked her over with the slow assessment of someone who had already decided what they were looking at and was simply confirming the inventory. You're in the PT records as passing your benchmarks. I am. You run a 14-minute 2-mile? 13:50 on the last assessment. He made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. That's the contractor minimum. Not exactly impressive. I'm meeting the requirements for my rotation. Sure, he tilted his head slightly. The question is whether you're meeting them because that's all you can do, or because that's all you bother doing. Mara held his gaze. Is there something you need from me, instructor? He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled the kind of smile that means the opposite of what smiles are supposed to mean. No, said, carry on. She did. Behind her, she heard him say something to the training aide at his shoulder. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. It doesn't belong here. She kept walking. Her jaw was tight, and she made it relax, one muscle at a time. 3 days later, she found sand packed into the bottom of her ruck. Yvessette's sin, not a little sand, enough to add nearly 8 pounds to the weight without being immediately obvious you'd feel it in the shoulders before you figured out what it was. She found it 20 minutes into the morning land navigation exercise when she stopped to redistribute the weight and opened the main compartment. She stood at the edge of a dry wash, alone in the high desert, and looked at the sand for a long moment. Then she redistributed what she could, shouldered the ruck, and finished the exercise. She logged a completion time that was 4 minutes slower than her baseline. On paper, that looked like deterioration. She knew exactly what it would look like in someone's assessment file, and she accepted it because the alternative reporting the sabotage would require explaining things she wasn't ready to explain. She was not yet ready to show what she was. The compound's training schedule included a biweekly close-quarters battle evaluation, a timed run through the CQB house, with role players playing opposing force. It was designed for the combat candidates, not for intel contractors, but attendance was listed as strongly recommended for all personnel, which was the institutional way of saying mandatory without the paperwork. Mara attended as an observer. She stood at the edge of the observation platform, with a clipboard and a stopwatch, logging times, noting patterns. The candidates moved through the house in pairs: working room clearances, communication protocol, dynamic entry. Some of them were good. A few were genuinely excellent. Reyes, she noticed, moved like someone who had done this in conditions that weren't simulated, smooth and controlled, no wasted motion. Most of them were working through the mechanics, still thinking about procedure, instead of letting procedure become reflex. From the platform, she could see angles they couldn't, choke points they were consistently missing on the second floor. A predictable fatal funnel on the north side entry that 3 of the last 4 pairs had entered the same wrong way. She wrote it down, said nothing. After the last pair finished, the evaluating instructor, a woman named Sergeant Caldwell, one of the few instructors at Blackridge who had treated Mara with something approaching professional neutrality, reviewed the results from her tablet. Overall pass rate today is 61%. North entry fatal funnel caught 5 of 8 pairs. She looked at the group. Anybody want to tell me what the fix is? Silence. A few trainees shifted weight. Mara looked at her clipboard. Caldwell's gaze moved across the group and landed on her. Contractor Vale, you've been watching all morning. What did you see? It was not an invitation. It was a test of a different kind than Caldwell probably knew. Mara looked up from the clipboard. The north entry has a 90-degree offset from the main corridor. Every team approached it the same way: straight stack, dominant shoulder against the near wall. The breachman's elbow cleared the threshold before his optic did. In a live environment, that's a half-second exposure before you picture. Caldwell was quiet. Fix is a modified button hook on the near man. Cross pattern on the far. Make the entry asymmetric so you're not giving the same silhouette at the same timestamp. She paused. But you probably already knew that. I did, Caldwell said. Her voice was neutral, unreadable. Thank you, contractor. Mara looked back at her clipboard. In her peripheral vision, she saw Reyes staring at her from across the platform. He wasn't smiling anymore. Whatever brief window of professional neutrality had existed closed within 48 hours of the CQB observation deck. She didn't know exactly what was said or by whom. She had her suspicions about had connections to Briggs, who had connections to things she hadn't fully mapped yet. What she knew was the result. The compound's informal social pressure, which had previously been friction, became something with edges. Nobody sat with her at meals unless forced to by seating assignments. The small courtesies of shared institutional life, someone holding a door, someone flagging you if you left a piece of gear behind, disappeared. When she ran the morning route, the other trainees on the same circuit pulled ahead or fell back to avoid running alongside her. Not obviously enough to be disciplined, obviously enough to be felt. It was the kind of pressure that's designed to make you doubt your own perception, to make you wonder whether you're being paranoid or whether the isolation is real. She had been in enough hostile environments to know the difference. She did her work. She logged her observations. She ate her meals alone and did not let the loneliness show on her face. At night, in the Block F bunk with the rattling duct, she lay awake and thought about Marcus and about Chen. The mission that had ended her operational career had been conducted in a place she was not authorized to name, even in her own memory, a small hour's extraction from a site that had gone from permissive to contested in the span of 11 minutes. The intelligence had been wrong. The threat picture had been wrong. And she had made a decision in a 12-foot hallway that she had been replaying ever since, in the particular way that you replay things you cannot change, looking for the choice that wasn't there. Marcus Hale had been her team lead, 7 years in special operations, the kind of operator who seemed born for it, calm under fire, exactly right, in the moments when being exactly right was the only thing that mattered. He had trusted her assessment. Chen Wei had been the youngest member of the team. 24 years old, he had a photograph of his daughter tucked into the band of his helmet. Mara had seen it. Every time they prepped for an op, had never said anything about it, because there was nothing to say. Both of them had died in that hallway. She had made it out. The after-action review had not cleared her. It had not formally charged her either. What it had done was remove her from active duty status with language carefully designed to mean everything and prove nothing. She had spent the following 18 months in a kind of professional purgatory, desk assignments, consulting roles, work that kept her inside 4 walls, doing work that kept her brain occupied, and her body growing soft in a way that felt like punishment she had chosen for herself. The Blackridge rotation was not officially a return to anything. The paperwork said it was a methodology review. She knew what it actually was. She was testing whether she could still function around the things that were required of people like her, the proximity to violence, the controlled aggression, the willingness to be the person in the room who acts when everyone else is processing. She needed to know if that was still in her, and she needed to know if she could keep it from consuming everything else. On day 14, Instructor Briggs put her in the pit. The sandbox was 40 feet across, packed sand bordered by a low concrete wall, used for controlled combatives training. It was not designed as a punishment space. It was used as one regularly. Close combat assessment, Briggs announced during morning formation. Vale, contractor, you're up. The trainees around her went still in that particular way, not silent exactly, but listening in a way that tries to look like indifference. I'm listed as an observer for combat assessments, Mara said. Her voice was level. My rotation doesn't require. It does now. He didn't look at her. Academy directive. All attached personnel complete a baseline combat evaluation by week 3. You're behind schedule. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. He knew she knew. The question was what she was going to do about it. She set down her clipboard. They gave her 3 trainees. Not 1-3. She would learn later that this had been deliberate, a decision made the previous evening in an off-record conversation she hadn't been part of. The 3 men selected, all from Reyes's training block, all with competitive combat records, had been told only that they were participating in a combatives demonstration. What they'd been told in private, she understood later from the way they moved into the pit, was that she was fair game. She entered the sandbox without a weapon. The three men spread into a loose triangle. Combat stances. Controlled, they weren't reckless. She'd give them that. Briggs raised the starter whistle. The yard was completely quiet. The whistle shrieked. The first man came in fast, leading with his right, expecting her to back up. She didn't back up. She stepped into him inside his extension before the force could build, redirected his arm down, and across his center line and let his own momentum fold him into the ground. The impact made a sound like a dropped bag of gear. The second man was already moving. She had a half second, maybe less. She used it to reset her balance and shift 90 degrees. So when he reached her, she wasn't where he'd aimed. His grab caught air. She used his extended arm as a lever, rotated her hips, and put him into the sand beside his teammate. The third man stopped. He was good, she could see it, in how he recalculated. He didn't commit immediately, which was the smart response. He tried to create distance, get her to come to him. She didn't. They stood in the pit for 4 seconds, which is a long time when nobody is moving. Then he came at her from a lower angle, changing tactics, trying for a takedown rather than a strike. She sprawled, dropped her weight, caught him on the way in, and when they came to rest, she was behind him with a controlling position that gave her exactly 3 options and him exactly 0. She held it for 2 seconds. Then she let go and stepped back. The yard was silent except for the wind off the ridge and the sound of sand settling. She picked up her clipboard from the wall where she'd set it. 41 seconds. She knew because she counted. "Baseline assessment complete?" she asked. Nobody answered. She walked back to the observation area. Behind her, she heard Briggs say something to the training aide, very quietly. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She had just made things considerably worse for herself, and she knew it. What came after was not subtle. Mara had hoped that the pit would satisfy some need in the compound's pecking order to establish where she fit. She had been wrong. What the pit did was shift the nature of the problem. Before, the pressure had been about making her feel unwelcome enough to leave quietly. After the sandbox, it became something else, a matter of institutional pride that had been damaged and the particular way that institutional pride responds to damage, which is just to escalate. 3 days after the pit, she was called to Instructor Briggs's office for a performance review. The performance review consisted of Briggs sitting across a metal desk in a room that smelled like old desk, in a room that smelled like coffee, and telling her that her completion times on navigation exercises were below standard. He had the numbers in front of him. The numbers were accurate. They were also the result of the 8 pounds of sand that had been packed into her ruck, but that wasn't a conversation she was having in this room. "You want to tell me why your land nav times have been degrading?" he asked. "Equipment issues," she said. "What kind of equipment issues?" "Pack weight distribution." His expression didn't change. "You having trouble loading your own gear?" "I resolved the issue." He studied her for a moment. "See that it stays resolved." "I'm putting a performance flag on your rotation record." A performance flag wasn't serious by itself. In her current cover, it was a minor administrative inconvenience. It was also a message the flag could be used later to justify pulling her from the rotation entirely, if the pressure didn't get the result it was looking for. "Understood," she said. She walked out of his office and stood in the corridor for a moment. The building was empty at this hour. Afternoon training was running in the South Range. She could hear the distant pop of live fire, rhythmic and controlled, somebody running drills. She breathed. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Chen. She thought about a 12-foot hallway at 3 in the morning. 3 in the morning, in a place she couldn't name. She thought about what she had promised herself when she came here. Not to become the weapon again. She had spent the last 2 weeks keeping that promise. Being careful, being controlled, absorbing pressure without becoming pressure. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the south range. On day 17, they ordered her to the striking platform. This was new, a training station she hadn't been assigned to before. A heavy steel plate mounted on a frame at shoulder height, used for impact conditioning. The station was usually part of the combat candidate's rotation, not intel contractors. Briggs assigned it. 300 strikes, logged by a training aide with a handheld counter. She stood in front of the plate. No gloves, her current kit didn't include them, and the supply room, per recent form, was unable to provide any. Her hands were already rough from 3 weeks of outdoor training. The skin thickened across the knuckles. She started. The plate rang with each impact. Not the flat slap of a pad, the hard, resonant clang of a steel surface that had no give, sending the force straight back into the bones of her hands. By strike 40, her knuckles were split. By strike 80, she could see blood on the plate. She kept going. The training aide with the counter shifted his weight. He was young, a specialist, and he kept almost saying something and then stopping himself. She could see him doing the math, deciding whether this qualified as something he should report, landing repeatedly on the conclusion that this wasn't his call. It wasn't cruelty in isolation. She understood that. It was a system of small decisions that individually might not cross a line, assembled into something that collectively did. Briggs knew exactly what he was doing. The individual components were all defensible. 200. Her hands were not okay. She was aware of that with the detached clarity of someone who has learned to partition pain, to know it, acknowledge it, and set it in a separate compartment from the part of her brain that was making decisions. It was a skill she'd developed over years of training and fieldwork, and she wasn't proud of it. It was useful, and it was also part of what frightened her. The ability to set pain aside efficiently, to keep functioning through damage. It was the same switch that she'd thrown in that hallway. The same switch that had let her do what she'd done and walk away while Marcus and Chen did not. 250. She did not stop. The aide's counter clicked. He had stopped watching her hands. He was looking at the middle distance with this expression of someone who would prefer to be somewhere else entirely. 300. She lowered her hands. Looked at them. The knuckles were a mess, split and bleeding. Across all 4 fingers on both hands, 1 fingernail cracked cleanly at the base. Done, the aide said quietly. He logged it and walked away without making eye contact. Mara stood at the platform for a moment. She pressed her hands flat against the steel. The cold surface felt almost good against the split skin and looked at the compound stretched out before her in the late afternoon light. Across the yard near the entrance to the CQB house, Reyes was watching her. He wasn't smiling. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, not quite respect, not quite guilt, something unresolved and uncomfortable. She picked up her clipboard with careful hands and walked toward the medical station to clean the damage before it got worse. She was halfway across the yard when Briggs stepped out of Building 2. Vale. She stopped. He walked toward her with that specific deliberate pace, the one that announces itself, that wants you to wait for it. He stopped 2 feet away, looked at her hands, looked at her face. 300, he said. Yes, a long pause. He tilted his head slightly. I've been thinking. 300 is the baseline we set for the assessment. She waited. I think the assessment needs to be recalibrated. She looked at him. Tomorrow morning, 450 strikes. Same platform, same conditions. He held her gaze. Consider it a remedial evaluation. She said nothing. He turned and walked back toward Building 2. Mara stood in the yard, her hands bleeding through the skin of her palms, the late sun long and flat across the sand. She thought, they are not going to stop. And for the first time since arriving at Blackridge, she felt the thing she had come here, afraid of feeling the thing she'd been trying not to become stir in the deep, quiet place where she'd put it. She cleaned her hands herself. The medical station at Blackridge was a single room in the back of building. 2 exam tables, a supply cabinet, a desk, where the duty medic sat when there was a duty medic present. At this hour, there wasn't one. Mara let herself in, found the antiseptic and gauze, and worked through her knuckles at the sink with the systematic attention of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The damage was worse than she'd allowed herself to register during the strikes. Both hands. Split skin across all 4 knuckles on the right, 3 on the left. The cracked nail on the left index finger would need to come off, eventually. It was already lifting at the base, the skin underneath raw and oozing. She cleaned it, pressed it flat, taped it down, and made a mental note to deal with it properly in a few days when the tissue beneath had a chance to stabilize. 450 tomorrow. Same platform, same conditions. She wrapped both hands in clean gauze, not thick enough to be obvious under gloves, tight enough to keep the split skin from opening further with every movement. She flexed her fingers. The tape pulled. The skin protested. She flexed again, testing the range, making sure she hadn't lost anything in the joints. She hadn't. She put her supplies back where she'd found them, leaving the station the way she'd found it, and walked out into the compound's evening air. The sky over Blackridge had gone the color of old rust, that brief window in the high desert when the day's heat starts releasing, and the light turns everything the same shade of amber, and for about 20 minutes, the compound looked almost like somewhere a person might want to be. Trainees were filtering back from afternoon training blocks. The smell of dust and sweat and the particular institutional funk of a mess hall beginning dinner service. Mara stood outside Building 4 and breathed. She let herself feel what she'd been holding at distance since Briggs's announcement, not anger, exactly. Anger was simple, and she'd stopped having simple feelings about complicated situations a long time ago. What she felt was closer to a calculation, arriving at its conclusion, the recognition that the situation had passed the point where patience was a sufficient response, and that the only remaining question was what kind of response was sufficient instead. She did not have an answer yet. She went to the mess hall, collected her tray, and sat alone. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual. She rarely slept well, anywhere. And Blackridge, with its rattling duct and the particular low-frequency tension of a place where something was building towards something else, was not a place designed for rest. She lay on her bunk and did the thing she'd taught herself to do when sleep wasn't available. She ran through what she knew, what she didn't know, and what she needed to know in the systematic way of someone who had learned that an organized mind in the dark is better than an anxious one. What she knew, the campaign against her had been orchestrated, not spontaneous. The attendance record, the boots, the sand in the ruck, those required access to systems and storage that wasn't available to ordinary trainees. Someone with institutional authority had either initiated or enabled it. Briggs was the visible face. He wasn't the only face. What she didn't know, whether the campaign was specific to her, what she actually was, or whether she had simply become a target of opportunity. A woman alone, no apparent connections, no rank to protect her. Easy. What she needed to know, how far they were willing to take it. The duct rattled. Outside, the wind pushed across the compound in waves she could hear but not feel. She closed her eyes and let the assessment run until it ran out of new material, and then she slept for 4 hours in the efficient way of someone who has learned to take what's available. The 450 strikes happened at 630. Briggs wasn't there. He'd sent the same training aide, the same young specialist who had counted 300 the day before and looked like he'd rather be processing supply requests in a different state. He arrived at the striking platform with his counter and his clipboard, and he didn't make eye contact, and Mara didn't require him to. She unwrapped the gauze from her hands, folded it, and put it in her pocket. Stood in front of the plate. "Ready when you are," she said. He clicked the counter to 0, nodded. She started. The plate rang. The split skin opened within the first 30 strikes. She felt it not sharply, more like a seam giving way, and acknowledged it and kept going. Impact conditioning is as much a mental discipline as a physical one. The body has a loud opinion about repeated blunt trauma to damaged tissue. Learning to hear that opinion and continue anyway is a specific skill that gets trained into you over years, and it stays trained into you whether you want it or not. She had not wanted it lately. At 120, the aide shifted his weight and said quietly, without looking at her, "You don't have to do this." She didn't stop. "Yes, I do. I can log the assessment as complete." "Briggs won't." "Don't." Her voice was flat. "Don't do that." A pause. The plate rang. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went back to counting. She reached 450 in a stretch of time she didn't track. She was aware of the pain as a background condition. The way you're aware of weather present, influential, not in charge. When she lowered her hands, they were bleeding again, worse than before. The aide logged the count, closed his clipboard. He stood for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, still not quite meeting her eyes. "I think this is wrong." "Log it and go," she said, not unkindly. He went. She wrapped her hands at the platform, using the gauze she'd brought, and walked back through the compound as the rest of the facility came to life around her. Word traveled the way it does in closed compounds, fast and imperfect, the facts outpacing the accurate version of them. By midday, most of the trainees in the facility knew something had happened at the striking platform. The specific numbers got warped in transmission. By the time Mara heard the second-hand version at the water station near Building 3, it had become 600 strikes, and her hands had been described as destroyed. The effect was not what Briggs had likely intended. She noticed it first, in small signals, the kind of environmental data that builds a picture before any individual piece of it means anything. The trainee who passed her in the corridor and held the door without the usual deliberate indifference. The woman from the Intel Field Officer Group, a compact, sharp-featured analyst named Voss, who had given Mara the same treatment as everyone else for 2 weeks, making eye contact in the mess hall and not immediately looking away. Reyes, passing her on the morning route, pulled up alongside her for about 30 seconds. He ran without saying anything. Then he said, 450? Yes. Another few seconds of nothing but footfalls on packed dirt. That's not a calibration, he said. That's something else. I know what it is. He didn't say anything after that. He let the pace carry him ahead and didn't look back. Whatever calculation Reyes was running, she couldn't read its conclusion yet. He was the kind of person who could move either direction toward something decent or away from it, and the decision would come down to some private arithmetic she wasn't party to. She noted it and let it go. Sergeant Caldwell found her in the map room on the afternoon of day 18. The map room was one of the quieter spaces in the compound, a long, narrow room lined with topographic charts and aerial imagery used for navigation planning and intel briefings. It was unoccupied most afternoons. Mara used it to do her actual work, the methodology review that was her official reason for being at Blackridge, the assessment framework she'd been developing between everything else. It gave her a reason to be somewhere, and it gave her a task her hands could do while her mind processed other things. Caldwell came in, without knocking. The door was open, and sat down across the table without preamble. Your hands. Mara looked up. They're fine. They don't look fine. They're functional. That's what matters. Caldwell studied her. She was in her late 30s, career NCO, the kind of person the military made more of when it was working correctly, and fewer of when it wasn't. She had a stillness about her that Mara recognized, not calm exactly, but the practiced quality of someone who had learned that most situations built respond better to steadiness than to force. I heard about the platform, Caldwell said. I assumed you would. Who ordered 450? Mara looked at her for a moment. It was a remedial assessment on a contractor who's not in the combatives rotation. It wasn't a question. Apparently, they recalibrated the requirements. Caldwell was quiet. Then, you could file a complaint with the oversight coordinator. That goes outside the academy's chain. I'm aware of the process. Are you going to use it? Mara looked at the map on the table. In front of her, a topographic survey of the training range, elevation lines packed close in the western section where the terrain got rough. She'd been annotating it without particular purpose, one of those automatic habits from a life spent building situational awareness in whatever environment she was in. Not yet, she said. Not yet. Caldwell repeated it without emphasis. Let it sit there. Then she stood up. For what it's worth, Vale and I want to be clear. I'm not speaking in any official capacity. What's happening here isn't sanctioned. It's enabled. There's a difference. But from where you're standing, I imagine it doesn't feel like much of one. Mara looked up at her. Who else knows? More people than have done anything about it. She said it without apology, just fact, flat and uncomfortable. She left. The door stayed open. Mara sat at the map table for a long time after that. The annotation on the topographic survey blurred slightly. She blinked, pressed her wrapped hand flat against the table surface. The pressure felt grounding and pulled her focus back. She thought about Marcus, briefly. The way he had trusted her read on a situation. The way that trust had cost him. She pushed it down, filed it, and started thinking, for the first time seriously, about what came next. The thing about sustained institutional pressure is that it creates a kind of tunnel vision in the people applying it. It becomes self-referential, the goal stops, being to achieve a specific outcome, and becomes instead the escalation itself. The next increment, the next demonstration of authority. They had moved from inconvenience to harassment, to physical pressure, to something that was approaching the edge of another category entirely, and from where Mara was sitting, she could see that the edge was the point. They wanted her to break visibly, to file a complaint, or crack in formation, or leave. Any of those would have been a satisfying conclusion. She had refused all three options, which meant the pressure had nowhere to go but further. She had known this was coming since day 3. She had been waiting for it since the sand in the ruck. On day 19, a trainee she didn't know came to her bunk at 2,100 hours. He was young, not the youngest in the facility, but close. Sandy hair, regulation cut, with the particular anxious energy of someone who has decided to do something and is fighting the part of themselves that knows it's going to have consequences. He knocked on the doorframe, even though the door was open. Contractor Vale? She was sitting on her bunk, writing notes. She looked up. Yes, he stopped. Started again. My name's Garrett. I'm in Block D, Special Ops candidate. Okay. He looked at the doorframe. At her. At the floor. I heard something I think you should know about. She set down her pen. Garrett came in and stood at the foot of the bunk. He stood like someone who hadn't fully committed to being in the room, yet weight back, shoulders tight, the posture of a person managing the impulse to leave. There's a group, 8 guys. Briggs's candidates, mostly, a couple from the independent rotation. He was looking at a point somewhere between his own boots and the wall. There's been talk. About you. About the pit. She waited. The pit thing. He swallowed. They didn't like how it went. Reyes and 2 of his guys being on the ground inside of a minute, that got around. And then, the platform thing, the strikes, he stopped. Some of them are saying it's not about training anymore. It's about making a point. What kind of point? He finally looked at her. The pre-inspection window. Day after tomorrow, the overnight, before Colonel Shaw's evaluation comes in. The compound goes quiet, security rotations minimal, most of the cadre is handling administrative closeout. He paused. That's the window they're planning to use. Mara was very still. Where? She asked. The old mining yard. West side of the perimeter, outside the standard patrol circuit. He shifted his weight. 8 men. They've got stun devices, the training models from the equipment room. They're not supposed to have them outside the designated training blocks, but someone pulled them from inventory. Stun devices. Not lethal, But at close range, in a confined space, with 8 men lethal, wasn't the only way to do serious damage. She looked at Garrett. He was still standing at the foot of her bunk with that half-in, half-out posture, and she could see exactly how much this conversation was costing him. He was a candidate in the same rotation as the men he was describing. What he was doing had a name, and in this world that name had weight. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it's wrong," he said, "and because he stopped. Because I saw what you did in that pit, and at the platform, and I think they're making a mistake. That's not the same as it being wrong." "No," he met her eyes, "but it's both." Mara studied him. He was telling the truth. She could read the markers, the specific texture of honesty, the civic of honesty that was uncomfortable in its own skin, not performing. He hadn't enjoyed having this information, and he'd come because he'd decided it was the right thing to do, not because it was easy. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Garrett." He nodded. Turned to leave, stopped at the door. "You should report it," he said. "The oversight coordinator. You could get them all." "Good night, Garrett." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, not quite understanding, but the shape of it. He nodded again and left. Mara sat in the quiet bunk room with the rattling duct and the amber light of the compound's night cycle, and she thought for a long time. She could report it. Garrett was right that she could. She had enough his account, the circumstantial pattern of the past 3 weeks, the inventory discrepancy on the stun devices to make a formal complaint that would move up the chain and land outside Briggs's jurisdiction. Shaw's inspection was 2 days away. If she filed tonight, she could have the situation resolved through institutional channels before anyone was in the mining yard. She sat with that possibility. She let herself feel the appeal of it, the clean resolution, the formal accountability, the outcome that required her to do nothing except write a report and trust the process. She knew what the process would find. She knew what would happen to Briggs and to the 8 men and to the Academy's operational record going into Shaw's inspection. And she knew with a clarity she didn't particularly enjoy that none of that was what she was actually weighing. What she was weighing was something else. She was weighing whether she had spent 19 days at Blackridge, being careful and controlled and deliberately smaller than she was, absorbing harassment and physical damage and institutional hostility, all in service of a question she hadn't answered yet. Whether she was still capable of being herself in the moments that required it. Not the weapon, not the thing she feared becoming, but herself. The version of herself that had existed before the hallway, before the review board, before 18 months of 4 walls and desk work, and the specific daily weight of knowing she had survived something that Marcus and Chen had not. The compound was quiet outside. Far across the facility, she heard the distant sound of a vehicle gate, the evening security rotation, changing over. Day after tomorrow, the pre-inspection window. 8 men in a dead mining yard. She could report it. She was not going to report it. Day 20 passed in an almost surreal normalcy. Morning PT, navigation exercise, East Ridge route, heavy ruck, her hands ached through the whole circuit, and she worked around it. Afternoon intel review in the map room, actual work, the methodology assessment that had become strangely grounding in its mundane specificity. Dinner, the mess hall, the particular institutional quiet of a compound in administrative close-out mode, instructors preoccupied with paperwork, trainees running through their own private calculations about the inspection to come. She saw Briggs once across the vehicle depot, supervising a gear inventory. He looked at her with the flat calculation of someone checking an item on a list. She held his gaze for a second and looked away first. Not because she had to, because she was choosing what to show and what to keep. She saw Garrett at dinner. He sat with his block, ate his meal, and looked at her once across the mess hall with an expression that was part question and part something she couldn't name. She gave him nothing in return. He looked away. She slept 6 hours. Woke at 100. lay in the dark and thought about Marcus and Chen for a while, the way she always did in the small hours when the discipline of daytime wasn't in place to redirect her. Thought about the hallway, thought about the decision that wasn't a decision that had been made before she understood she was making it. Thought about what Caldwell had said, enabled, not sanctioned. The difference between the two and whether it mattered to the people on the wrong end of either. At 145, she got up, put on her boots. Dark clothing, nothing reflective. She checked her hands, the gauze, the tape, the split knuckles that had been given one more day to knit and hadn't knitted enough, but were going to have to manage regardless. She walked out of Block F into the compound's night. The sky was hard and clear, stars sharp at this elevation. A thin moon that gave just enough light to navigate by, and not enough to make her visible at distance. She moved along the fence line toward the western perimeter, using the shadow of Building 6 as cover through the open section of yard, staying off the gravel paths where footsteps carried. The old mining yard was a relic from the site's original industrial life, a concrete pad, roughly 30 meters across, enclosed on 3 sides by the rusting frames of equipment shelters. The 4th side opened to the desert scrub beyond the perimeter fence. The academy used it for equipment storage overflow and for nothing else. It sat outside the regular patrol circuit by about 40 meters. She arrived at 155, stood at the edge of the equipment shelter shadows and let her eyes adjust fully to the dark. 30 meters of open concrete, equipment frames on 3 sides. One open approach. She walked to the center of the pad and stood there. Waited. At 200, she heard them coming. Not one set of footsteps multiple, moving from different approach vectors but converging. She had counted 8 by the time the first shape materialized from the equipment shelter shadows on the north side. Then another. Then 2 more from the east, laughing quietly the way people laugh when they're confident in the math. She stood in the center of the pad and did not move. The leader was the last to emerge. She recognized him by posture, a big man named Calloway, Block B, with the particular swagger of someone who had confused size with authority for long enough that the mistake had become structural. He was holding a stun device. She could see the faint LED indicator, the training model, orange light meaning armed. 8 men in a rough circle, roughly equidistant. They'd thought about the geometry. She'd give them that. Calloway looked at her across the space. He seemed surprised that she hadn't backed toward an exit. "Last chance, sweetheart," he said. "Walk away while you still can. Take your little methodology report in your damaged hands and get yourself on the first bus out of here." Nobody needs to know this happened. His voice had that particular confidence, the kind that comes from a group, from numbers, from the absolute conviction that the situation was already resolved. Mara looked at him. The moonlight was enough to see his face, the easy certainty in it. "Last chance," she said. "Quiet. Level. For you." A beat of silence. Then Calloway laughed. "Oh, that's good. That's actually." He was still laughing when she moved. Not toward Calloway. That was the first thing that surprised them. The instinct when you're facing the leader is to go for the leader, and she didn't. She went left, toward the 2 men on the eastern edge of the circle, the ones with the shortest sight lines to each other, the ones whose spacing told her they hadn't drilled any of this, had just spread out and assumed the geometry would do the work. The first man had maybe a quarter second of processing time before she was inside his reach. He started to raise his arm, the beginning of a grab, elbow coming up, and she was already past it, already behind the motion, using the rising elbow as a hinge point. She drove it upward and across his center line, felt his shoulder torque against its own joint, and redirected the accumulated force into the concrete pad. He went down hard on his left side. The impact sound was flat and sharp in the cold air. She didn't wait to watch him land, already moving. The second man on the eastern edge had a fraction more time and used it to pivot and charge rather than stand and reach, which was the right instinct. She met him at an angle instead of head-on. let his forward drive carry him past her left hip, while she caught his trailing arm and used his own velocity to swing him wide into the equipment frame on the shelter's east wall. The metal rang on impact. He slid down it and didn't get up immediately. 2 seconds. 2 men down. The circle was already breaking. That was the problem with a group that had never trained together. The moment the plan deviated from the script, each person defaulted to their individual read, and 8 individual reads pointed in 8 different directions. 2 men from the north side converged on her simultaneously, which was the right tactical response, and would have been more effective if they'd closed the angle instead of coming straight in parallel. She read their approach in the first step, both moving at identical speed, no separation in their timing, which meant they'd arrive as a wall rather than a sequence. She took 2 hard steps toward them, closing the distance faster than they'd expected, which collapsed their reaction window, and at the last moment, she dropped her level and went between them and winged them rather than into them. She came out of the crouch behind their line of travel, drove a forearm into the nearer man's lower back as she passed, and he stumbled forward into his partner. They went down together in a tangle of arms and compound profanity. She had a half-second of open space around her. She used it to breathe. 1 controlled inhale, 1 exhale reset. Her hands were not okay. Every impact had transmitted force, back through the damaged knuckles, not sharp pain exactly. More like the structural wrongness of force going through something that wasn't built to absorb it in its current condition. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a warning light on a dashboard, while driving at speed noted, cataloged, not acted upon. Calloway was moving. He'd gotten over the surprise faster than she'd credited him for. He was coming from the southwest angle, with the stun device held at his side, not raised yet, not committed to a specific deployment, which told her he was still processing the situation rather than acting on a prepared sequence. Good instinct. Bad enough position. Device down, she said. Clear, not loud. Command register. He kept moving. You've got to be. She cut the distance between them before he finished the sentence. He raised the device. She caught his wrist with both hands, the gauze on her knuckles pulled tight, and something in the damaged tissue flared white, and she twisted the wrist inward, forcing his grip to break along the line of least mechanical resistance. The stun device hit the concrete and skidded. He was bigger than her by 40 pounds, and he used it, grabbing her jacket collar with his free hand and pulling hard. She let him pull, moving with it rather than against it, using the force he'd invested to shift her weight and angle. He tried to drive her into the equipment frame. She pivoted on the contact and redirected. He hit the frame instead. Not cleanly, he managed to keep his footing, 1 hand on the frame, chest heaving. He turned. His face had changed. The confidence was still there, but it was different, now harder, less easy. The kind that comes from a place of injury to pride, rather than certainty of outcome. "The hell are you?" he said. Not quite a question. She didn't answer. The remaining 4 had regrouped. She was aware of them. In the periphery of her attention, the way you're aware of architecture in a room. She wasn't looking directly at them, but she knew where they were. 2 had stopped moving entirely. 1 was still on the ground from the frame impact. 1, the 8th man, tall, standing near the open edge of the yard, hadn't moved at all. He was just watching. Calloway came again. Lower this time, learning going for the legs, trying to change the physics of the problem. She sprawled, dropping her weight forward and down to deny the takedown, and caught his head on the way in, with a controlled strike from her forearm. Not a full-force hit, enough to create space. He dropped to 1 knee, and she stepped back. He knelt on the concrete, with his head down, breathing audibly. Not out, not finished, but recalculating. She could see him doing it. The math wasn't working out the way he'd expected, and he was trying to find the version where it did. "It's done," she said. "Same register. Flat, not unkind exactly, but not anything close to soft." He looked up at her. The LED on the stun device blinked orange on the concrete 6 feet away. Calloway, she said. It's done. A long, raw pause. He put his hands on his knee and pushed himself upright. He stood for a moment, testing his balance. He looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time since this had started, with the particular expression of someone who has encountered a gap between their model of reality and reality itself, and has not yet decided how to close it. Then he walked to the open edge of the yard. He didn't run. He walked, which was a form of dignity she acknowledged, even if he didn't know she was acknowledging it. The two who hadn't moved followed him without a word. The tall man near the open edge, the one who'd been watching the whole time, looked at Mara for a moment. Something passed across his face. Then he turned and walked out. 47 seconds. She knew because she counted. The compound was quiet. The mining yard was quiet. 6 men still on the concrete in various stages of recovery. The stun device's LED blinked orange in the dark. She stood in the center of the pad. Her hands were shaking, not from fear. The adrenaline half-life working through her system, the shaking was chemical, not emotional, and she knew the difference, and it didn't particularly matter. Her body was running through its own protocol, and she was standing in the middle of it, feeling it, not doing anything to stop it. She looked at her hands. The gauze had dark stains on both knuckles. One of the strips of tape on her left hand had come loose at the corner. One of the men on the ground, the one who'd gone into the equipment frame, pushed himself to sitting. He looked at her. He had the look of someone who had taken a hard surprise and was trying to inventory whether he'd been broken or just shaken. "You were waiting for us," he said. His voice was rough. She didn't answer. He looked at the yard, the other men, the device on the concrete, the open edge where Calloway and the others had walked out. He looked back at her. "Who are you?" he said. She picked up her clipboard from where she'd set it at the equipment frame before the circle had closed. She'd placed it there before they arrived. She hadn't been sure it would still be there when the yard cleared. It was. She walked out without answering him. The compound was silent at 300. The main buildings were dark, except for the duty light above Building 1. Patrol circuit had sight already at the western fence line. The patrol to Pastenspren and wouldn't return for another 20 minutes. She walked back to Block F along the same fence line she'd used to come out, moving at a normal pace, not rushing. If she was seen, running would be worse than walking. She was just a contractor who'd needed air. There were stranger things. She got back to her bunk and sat on the edge of it. The shaking had mostly stopped. The adrenaline was metabolizing, and what it left behind was the particular flat exhaustion of controlled violence, not the good, clean, tired of hard exercise, but the specific weight of having done something you'd been trained to do in a way that left nothing untouched. Her hands throbbed in a rhythm that matched her pulse. The cold from the compound's night was still in her clothes. She unwrapped the gauze from her right hand, looked at the knuckles. The split skin had opened further. The tape on her left hand was a loss she'd need to replace all of it before morning PT. She got up and went to the supply kit she kept in her footlocker. Sat back down on the bunk, worked through both hands in the dark, methodical, the way she'd been doing it for 3 weeks. Cleaned the damage, replaced the wrap, assess the function. Don't think about the function in the context of anything except the task immediately in front of you. She was almost done with the left hand when the thing she'd been keeping at the back of her attention moved forward. She sat with it, didn't push it away this time. She had gone to that yard alone, in the dark, because she needed to know something, and now she knew it. The specific quality of what she'd felt in the 47 seconds, the way her mind had moved through the problem, the way her body had responded, the absence of panic, the presence of something else instead, the trained, focused, precise thing that she had been before. Before the hallway, before the review board, before 18 months of trying to be smaller than she was. It was still there. She'd been afraid it wasn't. She'd been more afraid it was. The distinction she was finding was not as clean as she'd hoped. She had wanted to know whether she was still capable of being herself. The answer was yes, and the answer scared her in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Because being herself in a dark mining yard at 2 a.m. against 8 men was not the same thing as being herself in the world. One was a function, the other was a life. She didn't know yet whether the gap between them was crossable, and she was too tired at 330 in a Block F bunk to work through the problem with any precision. She finished the left hand, flexed her fingers. Adequate. She lay down, closed her eyes, did not sleep for a long time. Morning brought the consequences she'd been expecting, though not from the direction she'd prepared for. 615 PT formation. She stood in her block position and watched the assembly with the particular attention of someone waiting to see what version of events had survived the night. She could identify 5 of the 8 men from the previous night by their positioning in formation Mat 1. One of them was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing bruised ribs. Another had a split lip that hadn't been there yesterday. The rest of them stood at attention and looked straight ahead and collectively gave nothing. Calloway wasn't in formation. She didn't know what that meant yet. Briggs ran the morning briefing with his usual flat economy of words. Schedule, weather conditions, inspection prep timeline. Colonel Shaw's evaluation team would arrive at 900. All personnel were expected in formal training posture by 830. He didn't mention the mining yard. She watched his face through the briefing. He was performing normalcy with reasonable skill, not quite good enough if you knew what to look for. There was a tightness around his jaw and a quality the way he wasn't looking at her that was louder than if he had been on. He knew. She didn't know yet who had told him or what version they'd given him. After formation, she went back to Block F, changed into her formal inspection kit, and spent 40 minutes in the map room doing the actual work she'd been neglecting in the past 24 hours. At 7:45, Sergeant Caldwell appeared in the doorway. She looked at Mara for a moment, a specific assessing look, the kind you give someone when you're trying to match the version in front of you to something you heard. "You look fine," she said. "I am fine." 6 men reported to medical this morning. Mara kept her eyes on her notes. "I heard PT was hard yesterday." Caldwell came in and sat down. She folded her hands on the table. "You want to tell me what happened?" "There was an incident in the mining yard. Pre-inspection window. Minimal patrol coverage." Mara set her pen down. 8 men came to make a point. The point wasn't made the way they expected. Silence. 8 men, Caldwell said. Yes. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. She wasn't shocked Mara could read that much, but she was running through something, recalculating something. "Were you injured?" "My hands took additional damage." "Nothing that changes my functional status." Mara, Caldwell said her first name for the first time. Not formally, quietly. "Who are you?" Mara looked at her. "An intelligence contractor. Methodology review." Caldwell held her gaze. "That's what's in the file. That's what's in the file." A long beat. Caldwell stood up slowly. "Shaw arrives at 0900. He'll want a full compound brief and a personnel status report." She looked at Mara with the particular expression of someone choosing words with care. "Whatever's in your file, he's going to look at the full roster. He's thorough. I know. Do you?" It wasn't a question. She left. Mara sat in the map room and listened to the compound coming to life around her vehicle's voices, the organized urgency of a facility preparing for external evaluation. She thought about Colonel Shaw arriving at 900 with his evaluation team and his thorough habits and his security clearance level, which she knew from the pre-rotation briefing, was considerably higher than her current cover required. She thought about the file. The file said intelligence contractor. Mid-level clearance. 3-week methodology rotation. If Shaw was thorough and she knew his reputation, he would not stop at the surface of the file. He would pull threads. He would note that a mid-level contractor was listed for combat assessment benchmarks that didn't apply to her rotation category. He would note the performance flag. He would note 6 men in medical. She knew what he was going to find when he pulled the thread far enough. She had known it was a possibility when she accepted the rotation. She had decided 3 weeks ago that it was a risk she could accept. She was less certain of that now, sitting in the map room at 752 with her damaged hands flat on a topographic survey than she had been when she'd made the decision in the abstract. The abstract had not included 47 seconds in a mining yard. The abstract had not included Caldwell saying her name quietly, like it meant something. The abstract had not included Garrett standing in her doorway with the anxious courage of someone doing a right thing because it was right. She picked up her pen, finished her notes, closed the assessment folder. At 8:15, she heard the helicopter. The sound arrived before the aircraft was visible, the particular low percussion of a military spec transport cutting down from altitude, the kind of rotorcraft that announces itself as institutional authority and means it. The compound's activity pattern shifted immediately, the specific energy of a facility snapping to attention, not because anyone ordered it, but because the sound was its own order. She walked out of Building 3 onto the main compound path and looked up. The helicopter came in over the eastern ridge, dropping fast, following the valley, contour, with the practiced ease of pilots who had done this approach many times. It was a medium-frame utility bird, dark gray, no visible markings on the fuselage sides. It cleared the vehicle depot at about 200 feet and settled toward the landing pad behind Building 1 in a controlled descent that kicked a wall of rotor, wash across the compound dust, grit, the sharp percussive pressure of displaced air hitting everything in the yard. She stood still while it passed over. Let the wind do what it did. The helicopter touched down. The rotors began to cycle down. A ground crew moved toward the landing pad with the practiced efficiency of people who had a script for this particular arrival. The door opened. 2 personnel first evaluation team staff, carrying document cases, moving with the competent briskness of people whose entire professional purpose was to set up the conditions for something else. Then a third figure stepped out. Colonel Adrian Shaw was older than his file photograph. The photograph was 4 years out of date, and the 4 years had added something to him, not subtracted. He was compact, not tall, with the particular economy of movement that comes from a long career in places where efficiency of motion was not a preference, but a survival attribute. Silver in his hair, cut short. A face that had been in weather, in field conditions, in the particular unforgiving atmosphere of operational environments, for long enough that it had stopped performing and simply was. He walked off the landing pad and stopped. He looked at the compound. He did it the way Mara had done it on day 1, not like a tourist, not performing inspection, like someone reading a room. Then his eyes moved across the personnel assembled in the compound and stopped. Briefly, almost imperceptibly, on Mara, she was standing 40 meters away. She hadn't moved from the position she'd been in when the helicopter came in over the ridge. She hadn't arranged herself to be visible or invisible. She was just there. Shaw's gaze stayed on her for approximately 2 seconds. Then he turned to the compound commander who had come out to meet him, and the formal arrival protocol began. Mara looked down at her notes and walked back toward Building 3. Her pulse was slightly elevated. She noted that. The evaluation occupied the compound for the rest of the morning. Shaw's team moved with professional efficiency document checks, facility inspections, personnel records review. The compound's instructors moved through their assigned briefings with the particular tension of people trying to look less concerned than they were. Briggs was scheduled for a personnel records briefing at 1030. Mara was in the map room, 2 buildings away, and she spent that hour doing her work and not thinking about what was being said in that briefing room, and mostly succeeding. At 1115, a runner from Building 1 came to the map room. Contractor Vale. She looked up. Colonel Shaw requests your presence in the secure briefing room. Building 1, West Wing. She set down her pen, looked at her wrapped hands, looked at her notes. Tell him I'll be right there, she said. The runner left. She sat for a moment. The map room was quiet. Through the narrow window, she could see a section of the main compound path, empty now, the dust from the morning's helicopter arrivals still settling in the far corners of the yard. She thought about walking to Building 1 and telling Shaw the same thing she'd told everyone for 3 weeks. Methodology contractor. Mid-level clearance. Rotation complete in 4 days. She thought about whether that story still held. She picked up her assessment folder, stood up. She walked to Building 1. The secure briefing room was at the end of the West Wing corridor, a standard SCF configuration, cipher lock on the door, no windows. The runner was gone by the time she arrived. She stopped outside the door, breathed, pressed her wrapped hand against the cipher panel. The door opened. Shaw was alone. He was sitting at the briefing table with a manila folder open. In front of him, she recognized the color-coded edge of a classified personnel record. He did not look up immediately when she entered. He was reading something in the file, and he was reading it with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had already formed a conclusion and was confirming it against the evidence rather than looking for it. She sat down across from him. He finished reading, closed the folder, set it flat on the table. Then he looked at her. Direct, not unkind. The specific quality of attention that comes from someone who has spent a career assessing people under pressure and has gotten very good at it. Mara Vale, he said. Colonel, intelligence contractor. Methodology review. 3-week rotation at Blackridge Tactical Academy. He said it without emphasis. The words themselves carried the weight. That's right. He opened the folder again. Not to read, she had the impression he'd already memorized the content. He set his hand flat on the open page. This is what the file says, he said. This is not what I see. She said nothing. He looked at her hands. The gauze, the tape. The particular way she'd been holding them since she sat down, not favoring them. Exactly, but compensating. 6 men reported to medical this morning, he said. All from the same training block. All reporting the same vague description: training accident, equipment malfunction, various creative phrasings of I fell. He paused. That's an unusual number of simultaneous falls. Accidents happen in training environments. They do. He looked at her. I also reviewed your performance record for this rotation. The combat assessment benchmarks you completed. The striking platform evaluations. His voice was absolutely even. Those are not the benchmarks assigned to an intel contractor on a methodology rotation. The instructors updated the rotation requirements. They did. I've spoken with Sergeant Caldwell about that. He closed the folder, placed both hands on it. She was not entirely comfortable with how those requirements were updated. Silence. Shaw leaned back slightly in his chair. He had the quality of someone who was not trying to trap her, who had already decided something and was waiting to see what she decided. I've read the file, Mara, he said. Quietly, not the colonel at a briefing register. Something closer to a person. The actual file, not this one. She felt the words land. She didn't let anything show. There's an access level on the actual file, she said. Yes, I have it. He held her gaze. I know who you were. I know what the review board found, and I know what it didn't find, which is considerably more important. He paused. I know about Marcus Hale and Chen Wei. The room was very quiet. She held herself exactly still because that was what she was capable of in that moment. The names in his mouth, spoken without preamble in a secure briefing room in a compound that had spent 3 weeks treating her as a problem to be removed. The names arrived in her chest with the specific weight of things that have been carried alone for a long time and are suddenly no longer only yours. She said nothing. Shaw looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Why did you come here? The question was simple. She had been preparing a version of an answer 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, a clean, institutional answer that would satisfy a personnel review without opening anything underneath it. She had the language ready. She knew exactly how to deploy it. She looked at the folder on the table, at his hands, flat on the cover, at the secure room's bare walls. I needed to know if I could still function, she said, in an environment where function was required. And she looked at him. I can. I know. He said it simply without ceremony. I knew it before I read this file, before the 6 men in medical, before any of this. I knew it when I stepped off the helicopter and looked at this compound. He paused. I saw a facility that had been systematically trying to break someone who wouldn't break. That's a particular kind of evidence. He stood up, picked up the folder. I want a full account, he said. Everything. The attendance records, the boots, the pack weight, the platform assessments. Last night, he met her eyes. Everything. She looked at him, and after that, he said, I think we have a conversation about what comes next. He walked to the door, opened it, paused with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said, not turning around. The review board was wrong. They found a mission failure. They didn't look hard enough for what was underneath it. He walked out. The door stayed open. Mara sat in the secure briefing room for a long time, alone, with the psych light blinking green in the quiet. She pressed her wrapped hands flat on the table, both of them, the way she'd done at the striking platform, the way she'd done in the map room. The pressure, the cold surface, the resistance. She breathed. Outside, through the distant sounds of the compound, she heard a second vehicle arriving. More of Shaw's team. The machinery of an external evaluation doing what it was designed to do. For the first time in 19 days and 18 months, she let herself consider the possibility that possibilities that something was going to be different when she walked out of this room. She didn't let herself believe it yet. Not fully. Old damage doesn't dissolve in a single conversation. And she was too careful, too trained, too aware of her own tendency to protect the undefended parts of herself, to give the feeling more than a careful amount of room. But she let herself feel the shape of it. That was enough. For now, that was enough. She sat in that room for 11 minutes before she moved. Not because she needed 11 minutes, because she gave herself exactly that much time to let the conversation settle into something she could carry, without it running loose the way you secure equipment before a move, not out of ceremony, but because unsecured things cause damage when the terrain gets rough. Shaw had said the review board was wrong. She had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone with the authority to say it. The weight of that surprised her. She had told herself for 18 months that she didn't need external validation, that she had already run the analysis, already knew the variables, already understood the specific architecture of how a mission with bad intelligence and a contaminated threat picture produces outcomes that aren't the same thing as fault, even when they feel indistinguishable from it. She had known all of that. Knowing it and hearing it said out loud by someone who had read the actual file were not the same thing, and she sat with that gap for 11 minutes, and then she stood up and walked out to find Shaw. He was in the compound commander's office, a room that had been temporarily converted to an evaluation workspace. 2 of his staff, working at fold-out tables with document cases open, a secure communications terminal set up against the far wall. Shaw was standing at the window with a coffee mug and a personnel report, reviewing something in the report with the focused quiet of someone who reads the way other people breathe. He looked up when she came in. "Sit down," he said. Not formal, practical, she sat. One of his staff, a young captain with close cropped hair, and the particular efficient stillness of someone trained to be invisible when invisibility was required, set a second mug on the table in front of her and stepped back. Shaw put the report down, pulled a chair around, and sat across from her, not behind the desk. That choice registered. "Start with day 1, he said. She started with day 1. She gave him the full account in the flat, sequential way of someone who has delivered operational after-action reports before specific, timed where she could time it, stripped of editorial commentary, except where the editorial commentary was itself a relevant data point. The bunk assignment, the boots, the attendance log, the sand in the ruck, the CQB observation deck, the pit, the strikingless platform, both sessions, both counts, the specific damage to her hands. Caldwell's visit to the map room. Garrett's warning. The mining yard. She described the mining yard without particular emphasis, the geometry of the approach, the 8 men, the stun device's LED indicator, the 47 seconds, the specific physical demands of the engagement, and what it had cost her hands. Shaw listened without interrupting. His expression moved very little. She watched it anyway, from habit, cataloging what the small shifts told her about where his attention concentrated. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the ambient sound of the evaluation staff's work at the fold-out tables. Shaw set his mug down. "Calloway," he said. "What was your read on him?" The question surprised her slightly, not the topic, but the angle. "Institutional," she said. "Not personal. He didn't know me. He'd decided what I was from the available evidence, and the available evidence had been curated by someone else. Briggs. Briggs was the visible structure. I don't know the full shape of who was behind Briggs." Shaw picked up the personnel report he'd been reading when she came in, and it turned face up and set it on the table between them. She looked at it. It was Briggs's service record. She could see the header, with several sections flagged in red. "Briggs has a pattern," Shaw said. "This isn't the first facility. He spent 2 years at a training command in the Southwest, where 4 female personnel filed formal complaints in an 18-month window. 3 of the 4 were resolved internally. 1 went to the oversight board and resulted in a letter of concern." He paused. A letter of concern. Not removal, not formal sanction. "A letter. Enabled, not sanctioned," Mara said. Shaw looked at her. "Caldwell?" She used the phrase on day 18. He nodded. He took the record back, closed it. "Briggs is done. That decision was made before I landed. The record was enough. The mining yard accelerates the timeline, but it doesn't change the outcome. And the 8 men. Formal proceedings. The stun device removal from inventory is a documented offense, regardless of what they intended to do with it. That gives us a clean administrative hook that doesn't require your account to be the primary evidence." He said it without apology, but also without any pretense that the framing didn't serve multiple purposes. "Your name stays out of the formal record where possible." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for that. I know you're not. I'm doing it anyway." He held her gaze. "Not to protect you. To protect the integrity of what I need to do next, which is close this evaluation. Without creating a public record, that becomes a reference document for the next person who wants to make a similar argument about why someone like you doesn't belong in an environment like this." Mara was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. The staff captain appeared with a second folder and set it on the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment in the conversation. Shaw opened it. Inside was a personnel file. Mara recognized the classification markings on the header before she could read the name, the color coding, the access level indicators. She recognized them because she'd seen the same markings on her own file, the actual one, the one Shaw had described as behind the mid-level contractor cover. He turned the folder so it faced her. She read the header, her own name, her actual record. He gave her a moment to look at it. "The review board's finding is in there," he said. "Operational failure, contributing factors, recommendations. You know what it says. I know what it says. What it doesn't say is this." He reached into the folder and extracted a single document, a separate page, newer paper, different formatting. He set it flat between them. "This is a supplemental assessment I commissioned 7 months ago. Independent review of the mission record, the intelligence package, that was issued pre-operation. The threat assessment that was provided to your team. She looked at the document. She didn't touch it. The intelligence was wrong, he said. Not field wrong, wrong at source. The threat picture your team was given had been degraded before the brief. Someone in the assessment pipeline passed a contaminated package, and the contamination wasn't caught. He paused. Your decision in that hallway was made on information that was materially incorrect. You could not have known that the secondary threat was positioned where it was, because the secondary threat was not in any document your team received. She was very still. Marcus Hale and Chen Wei died because of a bad intelligence product, Shaw said. Not because of a decision you made in a hallway. The room was quiet for a long time. She looked at the supplemental assessment. At the clean bureaucratic language of it, the measured phrasing of an official document that translated 18 months of guilt into a finding of systemic failure. She had always known, in the abstract, logical part of her brain that could run the variables and arrive at accurate conclusions, that this was possible, that the intelligence had been wrong. That wrong intelligence produces outcomes that aren't the same as fault. She had known it. Having it documented was different. Why didn't this come to me before? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Because I commissioned it 7 months ago, and the review process takes time, and the people who should have flagged this to you were too busy managing the institutional fallout from the original review board to revisit a finding that was already closed. His voice was flat. Not apologetic, he hadn't made the original error, but clear-eyed about the machinery of how institutions handle things they'd rather not revisit. Closed, she said. He looked at her. I reopened it. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Both hands, the gauze rough under her palms. She kept her face level. The thing happening in her chest was considerable, and she was managing it with everything she had, and she could feel with everything she had, and she could feel the edges of that management, the places where it might not hold. And she pulled in from those edges deliberately. She breathed. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady. Okay. The debrief ran for 2 more hours. Shaw's staff captain took detailed notes. Shaw himself moved between the big picture framing and specific operational questions, with the ease of someone who can hold both scales simultaneously, the systemic failure of Briggs's harassment program and the specific sequence of the mining yard, the administrative record gaps in the physical evidence, the cover identity that would need formal dissolution, and the question of what came after that dissolution. It was the last part that brought the conversation to the place she'd known it was moving toward, since he'd said, "What comes next?" in the secure briefing room. There's a unit, Shaw said. I'm not going to give you the full brief in this room that requires a different environment and a different set of clearances than I can invoke here at Blackridge. What I can tell you is the broad shape of it. She waited. Small, highly selective. Operates in the space between conventional intelligence work and direct action, the kind of problems that need someone who can read a situation and respond to it without requiring a 3-day approval chain. He looked at her steadily. Someone who can function in an ambiguous environment with incomplete information and make correct decisions under pressure. That description applies to a lot of people. It does. The other part of the description applies to fewer. He paused. Someone who has been through exactly the kind of failure that breaks most people and is still standing, still thinking, still capable of the specific quality of judgment that knows when to act and when to hold. Mara looked at him. You're recruiting me. I'm offering you an option. There's a difference. He folded his hands. You can finish the rotation. Take your methodology report back to wherever it was supposed to go, and return to the desk, work that's been your life for the past 18 months. That's a legitimate choice, and I'm not characterizing it as failure. She held his gaze. Or, she said, or you accept a formal offer to join a unit that actually needs what you have. Not a version of you that's been reduced to contractor benchmarks and sand-weighted rucks. The actual thing. He said it without drama. Just placed it on the table like the supplemental assessment, a piece of evidence, not a sales pitch. The room was quiet except for the staff captain's pen. Mara looked at the table, at her hands, at the folder with her actual name on it. She thought about the question she'd asked herself when she came to Blackridge. Whether she could still function, whether the thing she'd been afraid of, the weapon, the cold efficiency of the trained response, had consumed whatever else was underneath it. She had her answer. She had 47 seconds of evidence, and she had this debrief, and she had Shaw's supplemental assessment sitting on the table in front of her. "I need to think," she said. "I know." He didn't push it. "You have until I leave tomorrow morning. That's not a pressure timeline. That's just the logistics of when I can receive a formal response." He stood, began gathering the folders with the organized efficiency of someone accustomed to packing sensitive material. She stood too. At the door, she stopped. "The review board," she said. "The original finding. Does it get corrected in the official record?" He looked at her. "Yes, that's already in process." He paused. "It won't be public. The nature of the mission precludes a public record. But within the systems that matter, within the records that follow you, yes." She nodded, put her hand on the doorframe. "Marcus Hale had a daughter," she said. 7 years old when he died. Shaw looked at her. "I'd like to know she's being taken care of. Whatever programs exist. I'd like to know someone's paying attention to that." A pause. "I'll look into it," he said. "You have my word." She walked out. The compound had a different quality in the afternoon following Shaw's arrival. The evaluation was ongoing. His staff moved through the buildings with their clipboards and their document cases, but the specific institutional tension that Blackridge had been running on for 3 weeks had changed its register. The information had spread the way. Information spreads in a closed environment, faster than any official communication, slower than rumor, arriving in most people's awareness as a general sense that something had shifted without the specific facts that would explain exactly what. She saw Briggs once from a distance. He was coming out of the commander's office with the particular tight-shouldered posture of someone who had just received informations he'd known was coming and had been dreading anyway. He didn't see her. She didn't arrange to be seen. She walked to the medical station and had her hands properly assessed by the duty medic, a compact, efficient woman named Specialist Torres, who looked at the split knuckles and the damaged nail and the accumulated impact damage with the expression of someone professionally required to maintain neutrality and finding it a significant effort. "How long has this been like this?" Torres asked, turning the left hand over in her own. 3 weeks of progressive damage. Progressive. Torres said it with a particular flatness. "The nail needs to come off today. The skin on both hands needs proper treatment and about a week of not being hit against anything. I'll take the nail. The rest is manageable." "I didn't say manageable. I said it needs a week." Noted. Torres looked at her for a moment with the assessing expression of someone deciding whether to push the point. She'd decided against it, which was the right call. The nail removal took 12 minutes and was unpleasant in the specific way of minor medical procedures that require you to hold still through something your body would prefer to move away from. She held still. Torres worked quickly and without commentary, which Mara appreciated. When it was done, Torres wrapped both hands in proper medical gauze, real gauze, not the field supply she'd been working with, and made a note in the intake log. "You're in the evaluation record now," she said. "As of today." "That's fine." Torres capped her pen. She looked at Mara with the particular quality of someone who has been in institutional environments long enough to understand what a documented injury in an evaluation window means. "Good," Torres said simply, and turned back to her supply cabinet. She found Garrett at the vehicle depot at 1,600. He was doing a scheduled maintenance check on one of the training trucks, the kind of routine task that exists in all military environments designed to occupy hands and give a certain kind of organized mind something to work on. He was under the hood with a flashlight and a clipboard when she walked up. He heard her coming and looked up. He took in her hands the proper medical wrapping, the different quality of it compared to the field gauze he'd seen before. Medical, he said. Overdue. He put his flashlight down, stood up straight. He had the look of someone who had been waiting to find out what was going to happen and hadn't let himself form an opinion in the meantime, because forming an opinion felt like tempting something. Shaw's team is in Briggs's office, he said. I know. Calloway's in administrative holding pending review. He paused. Word is it's all 8. That's accurate. He looked at her, then at the truck, then back at her. Did you know? He said, when I came to your bunk. Did you already know you were going to go to that yard instead of reporting it? She considered the question. He deserved a real answer. Not when you came to my bunk, she said. I decided after you left. He absorbed that. Why? Because I needed to know something, she said. And the mining yard was the only place I could get the answer. He was quiet for a moment. Did you get it? He asked. Yes. He looked at the truck, back at her. Some question moved across his face that he almost asked, and then didn't. The compound is recommending you for a commendation, she said, for reporting what you heard. Caldwell put it in the evaluation record. Something shifted in his expression, not pride exactly, more like relief. The specific relief of someone who had done the right thing for the right reasons and had been uncertain whether the right thing was going to matter. He stopped. I just thought it was wrong. It was, she said. You were right to say something. She put her wrapped hand briefly on the truck's hood. A small gesture, nothing deliberate. Just the habit of physical contact with a surface when you're finishing a conversation and needing a moment to close it. Then she walked back toward the main compound. She went to the memorial wall at 1730. It wasn't a Blackridge structure. It was older than the facility's current iteration, a section of the original perimeter wall, weathered concrete, where previous occupants of the site had inscribed names and unit designations and dates. The academy had left it in place when they repurposed the compound. Nobody had given her a briefing on it. She'd found it on day 4, on a walking route she'd taken specifically to map the compound's edges. She stood in front of it now in the long, late light. Names she didn't know, units she'd never been part of, dates that ranged across decades. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Chen and the photograph of his daughter tucked into the band of his helmet. She had been carrying the weight of those 2 men as a sentence, not consciously, not deliberately, but structurally. The way you carry something without realizing the full load until you set it down and feel the absence of it in your shoulders. The review board's finding had given her a framework for that weight. She had failed, and the weight was the appropriate cost of failure. And she would carry it as long as she lived, because anything less would be a disrespect to the men who hadn't made it out. The supplemental assessments had changed the framework without removing the weight. She had not failed. The mission had failed. The intelligence had failed. Circumstances that she could not have controlled and had not been given the tools to overcome had produced an outcome she had spent 18 months treating as something she owed a debt for, and the debt wasn't hers. She understood that. She stood in front of the memorial wall, and she understood it cleanly. The weight was still there. That was the part she hadn't fully anticipated. She had thought in some half-formed way that the answer to the question of blame, the real answer, the documented one, would lift the weight. It hadn't. Marcus was still dead. Chen was still dead. The photograph of his daughter was still in a box somewhere, or in his family's keeping, or lost. They were still gone, and she was still here, and the supplemental assessment didn't change any of that. What it changed was the story she was telling herself about why. She stood at the wall for a long time, long enough for the light to shift, for the compound's evening sounds to begin, the mess hall opening, vehicle gates cycling, the distant sound of the last evaluation briefing finishing in Building 1. She was not going to stop thinking about them. She was not going to stop feeling the weight of it. She had been wrong to think that clearing the formal record would clear something inside her. And she'd known that. And she was facing the gap between what she'd known and what she'd hoped in the honest way of someone who had stopped being able to afford dishonesty with herself. She could carry the weight differently. That was the thing. That was what she was figuring out, standing at a memorial wall she had no connection to, in a compound that had spent 3 weeks trying to break her and failed. She could carry it as a debt she owed. It was the version she'd been living. Or she could carry it as the specific gravity of having survived something terrible and being obligated not to suffer, but to do. To use the survival for something. The difference between punishment and purpose. She breathed. The evening air off the ridge was cold and clean. She turned and walked back toward the main compound. She knocked on the door of the temporary evaluation office at 2045. Shaw's staff captain opened it. Shaw was inside, reviewing documents at the desk still working, which she'd expected. He looked up. "My answer is yes," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the particular economy of someone who doesn't add words to moments that don't need them. "I'll have the formal paperwork initiated in the morning," he said, "before I leave." "All right." She turned to go. "Vale." She stopped. "For what it's worth," he said. He paused, the way he did when he was finding the right version of something rather than the convenient one. Hale and weigh. The supplemental assessment names them correctly in its finding. Not as losses to be accounted for. As operators who were let down by a system that owed them better. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame. "Thank you," she said. She walked out. The compound was dark and quiet. Above the eastern ridge, the stars were sharp and thick the way they only get at altitude, the sky doing nothing more complicated than being what it was. She walked back to Block F with her properly wrapped hands at her sides. And for the first time in 3 weeks and 18 months, the walk felt like something other than the distance between one place she didn't belong and another. She slept 7 hours. Not the 4-hour efficiency sleep of someone rationing rest. Not the fractured half-sleep of someone whose mind won't stand down. 7 hours. Solid, the kind of sleep that comes when something that has been held at tension for a very long time is finally allowed to release. She woke at 530 to the compound's morning, sounds the first vehicle gate, the duty officer's radio check, the distant mechanical complaint of the mess hall's ventilation system, and lay in the Block F bunk for a few minutes, listening to the duct that had rattled every night for 3 weeks. It was still rattling. She got up, dressed, and went to find coffee. Shaw's helicopter was scheduled to depart at 900. By 700, the evaluation team was in close-out mode, document cases being packed, the secure communications terminal being dismantled with the efficient reverse engineering of people who had set it up and would set it up again somewhere else. The compound moved around them with the particular morning energy of a facility that had received an external evaluation and was now calculating what the results would mean. She got her coffee from the mess hall urn and stood outside with it, watching the compound come to life. The sky was clear, the same hard desert blue that it had been for most of her 3 weeks at Blackridge, the kind of sky that gives you distance and perspective whether you want it or not. She was on her second cup when Caldwell found her. Caldwell came out of Building 2 with her own coffee and stopped beside Mara without preamble, the way she had come to do things without announcing herself, without performing the social ritual of the approach. "You're leaving today," Caldwell said. After Shaw's brief. Mid-morning. Caldwell looked at the compound, at the evaluation team's vehicles near Building 1, at the early trainees filtering toward the PT formation area. "The rotation replacement comes in Thursday," she said. Another contractor. "I've already reviewed the intake file." She paused. "It's going to be different." Mara looked at her. The new standing order from Shaw's evaluation removes the discretionary combat assessment requirement for intel contractors, Caldwell said. It removes the expanded benchmarks. It removes the informal authority that allowed instructors to assign supplemental physical training to non-combat personnel without a formal sign-off chain. She took a drink of her coffee. It won't fix everything. It never does. But it's structural, and structural is better than hoping. It's better than hoping, Mara agreed. They stood together for a moment. The morning light was long and flat across the compound, turning the dust to amber. "Can I ask you something?" Caldwell said. "The pit." Day 8. She looked at Mara. 3 men in under a minute. "I've seen your contractor file. I've seen the benchmarks you were posting before the pit. They didn't match." She paused. "I knew that day that the file was wrong. I just didn't know which direction." Mara looked at her coffee. "You could have reported it then," Caldwell said. "The discrepancy, the pressure, any of it. You had enough by day 8 to make a case." "I know, but you didn't." "No." Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "Because of whatever you needed to find out." "Yes." Another. Caldwell looked at the horizon line over the eastern ridge, where the sky was beginning to build toward the full hard brightness of desert morning. "Did you?" she said. "Find it out?" Mara thought about the mining yard, about the briefing room, about the memorial wall in the long evening light. "Most of it," she said. Caldwell nodded slowly. She didn't ask what the rest was. That was the right call. "Good luck," she said. She put the word in the sentence like she meant it, not the automatic valediction, but the actual thing. She went back inside. Mara finished her coffee, turned the mug in her wrapped hands, set it down on the ledge outside Building 2, walked to the formal debrief. The formal debrief was in Building 1's main conference room, and it was the most people Mara had been in a room with for official business since her review board. Shaw at the head of the table, his staff captain beside him, 2 of the evaluation team's documentation specialists along the near wall. The compound commander, a lieutenant colonel named Whitmore, who had been conspicuously absent for most of the situations Mara had navigated in the past 3 weeks. His absence itself, a form of enabling, she hadn't addressed and wasn't going to address now, sat at session of a man who had been given a very clear picture of his command's failures and was managing the experience. Briggs was not in the room. She had expected that. Shaw opened the debrief with the evaluation summary facility, program standards, operational compliance, the formal language of institutional assessment delivered with the particular efficiency of someone who had done enough of these to know exactly where the weight should fall and where it was wasted. Then he turned to the personnel section. Effective immediately, Instructor Briggs is removed from operational posting at this facility pending formal review proceedings. Shaw said it without drama, without pause, the way you read a coordinate, precisely, without editorializing. The formal review will incorporate the documented pattern from his previous command posting and the specific incidents from this evaluation, period. I expect it to result in separation. Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Shaw either didn't notice or chose not to. 8 trainees currently in administrative hold will face formal proceedings under the UCMJ for unauthorized removal of training equipment and conduct unbecoming. The proceedings will be conducted through the standard review chain. He looked at the room. I want to be clear about the framing. This is not an outcome that arose from a single incident. It is the result of a command climate that permitted escalating conduct over a sustained period. The formal record will reflect that. Whitmore looked at the table. Sergeant Caldwell, Shaw continued, is commended for her professional conduct and her efforts to maintain appropriate standards during this evaluation period. That commendation will go into her service record today. Mara kept her face still. Trainee Garrett, Block D, is commended for reporting conduct that endangered another person's welfare. The commendation will reflect specifically that he reported up the chain without certainty of outcome, which is the harder version of doing the right thing and the version that actually matters. She thought about Garrett under the truck hood, saying, "I just thought it was wrong." Something moved through her chest that she let pass without naming. Shaw moved through the remaining evaluation items with the same efficient precision. Training program modifications. New sign-off requirements for contractor rotations. Medical protocol updates that Torres had apparently submitted on her own initiative the previous evening, which Shaw flagged for approval with a single line and no elaboration. Then he closed his folder. "Contractor Vale," he said. She looked at him. "Your methodology assessment will be formally closed today. Your rotation record will reflect satisfactory completion with commendation for professional conduct under adverse conditions." He looked at the room briefly. "The adverse conditions will also be reflected for the record." Whitmore shifted in his chair. "That's all," Shaw said. The room began to move, chairs pushing back, documents being collected, the organized dispersal of a formal meeting reaching its conclusion. Mara stood. Shaw caught her eye and tilted his head slightly toward the door, the private conversation gesture, brief and unambiguous. She followed him into the corridor. They stood at the end of the building one hallway, where it opened onto a narrow exterior passage, a service corridor, empty, the compound sounds reaching them as ambient noise rather than immediate presence. Shaw had a document envelope in his hand. He held it out. She took it. Heavy paper, sealed, classification markings on the outside. "Unit brief," he said. "Don't open it here. Secure location. When you're ready." She held it at her side. "The unit has a formal entry process," he said. "Medical clearance, psychological evaluation, a second-stage assessment that won't look anything like what you've been through here. It takes about 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, you're technically in a transitional status not assigned, not cleared for operations." He paused. "Use the time." "For what?" He looked at her steadily. "Whatever you need to use it for. Sleep, eat, let your hands heal." He glanced at the gauze briefly. "See whoever you haven't seen in 18 months. Do the things that aren't operational." She looked at the envelope. "You're telling me to take a break." "I'm telling you that the people I want in that unit are the ones who know how to exist between missions, not just during them." He said it without particular weight, but she heard the weight underneath it. "The ones who've forgotten how they burn out, or they calcify, or they make the kind of decision in a hallway that gets made differently by someone who had a life outside the work." It landed precisely where he'd intended it to. "I'll be in contact through the number in that envelope," he said. "Any questions before I leave, ask now. After I'm gone, the contact process is in the document." She thought for a moment. "Chenwei's daughter," she said. "You said you'd look into it." "I did." He met her eyes. "Last night. Her name is Lily. She's 8 now. Her mother has full custody, and they're in a stable situation. Chen's survivor benefits are current, and the family has support from his unit's family readiness organization." He paused. "She apparently wants to be a marine biologist. There's a note in the family file from 18 months ago, where a case officer recorded that Lily has named her goldfish after her father." Mara looked at the wall. "Lily Way," she said quietly. "Yes." She stood with that for a moment. The corridor was quiet. Outside somewhere, across the compound, she heard rotors beginning to turn, the helicopter starting its pre-departure cycle. "Thank you," she said. "You should write to her," Shaw said. "Not to the daughter, she's 8. She doesn't know who you are. But to the mother, Yunaway. She knows your name. She knows you were in that hallway." He paused. "People in that situation, they don't always want answers. But they usually want to know that someone else is still carrying it. That they're not carrying it alone." Mara was quiet. "That's not an order," Shaw said. "I know." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, and he held it for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be genuine, short enough to leave her dignity. "Good luck, Vale." He walked toward the landing pad. She stood in the service corridor with the document envelope at her side and listened to the helicopter's rotors build from idle to operational. The sound filling the compound and then lifting away into the desert sky until it was the size of a sound rather than a presence, and then nothing. She spent the last 2 hours at Blackridge, doing the small terminal tasks of departure returning, equipment, closing out her bunk assignment, collecting the few items she'd brought with her. Her duffel was no heavier leaving than it had been arriving. Her assessment folder went into it, completed. Her personal kit, the field gauze she'd been working with for 3 weeks, which she set in the waste bin at the Block F entrance because it had served its purpose. Reyes was at the vehicle depot when she came through to catch her transport. He was cleaning gear, the particular methodical work of someone who does maintenance tasks when they need to occupy themselves. He looked up when she walked through. Set the cleaning cloth down. They looked at each other for a moment. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. He had the look of someone who had spent several days running a calculation and had arrived at a result he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "The pit," he said. "Day 8. She waited. "I told Briggs about the observation deck. What you said about the north entry." He said it flat. Not apologetic, exactly, not performing anything. Just stating what he'd done and its weight. "I told him it looked like you knew too much for what was in your file. He already had a read on you. I gave him more material." She looked at him. "I didn't know it was going to go as far as it went," he said. "I want to be clear that I knew it was going to go somewhere." She held his gaze. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're leaving, and I'm staying, and I'd rather you hear it from me than not hear it at all." He picked up the cleaning cloth. "Set it back down. I've been in this program for 8 months. Everything I am right now, professionally, is tied to this place and these people and the career that follows from getting through this rotation." He looked at her. "And I watched what they did to you for 3 weeks, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I watched you come through it, and I need you to know that I know what that cost me as a person." She studied him. He was not comfortable. He was not performing discomfort. It was the kind that comes from someone who has a clear-eyed understanding of who they were in a situation and finds the understanding objectionable. That was something. Not enough, but something. "Garrett spoke up," she said. "He's 2 years younger than you and has less to lose and more to gain from keeping his head down, and he knocked on my door. Anyway." Reyes absorbed that. "I know," he said. She picked up her duffel. "I won't tell you what to do with that. That's yours to figure out." She walked past him toward the transport vehicle. She was almost at the vehicle when she heard him behind her. "For what it's worth, the pit. The strikes. Last night." A pause. "I've been in this program 8 months. I've never seen anything like it." She stopped walking. Didn't turn around. "That's not worth what you think it's worth," she said. A long beat. "No," he said. "I know." She got in the transport. The bus took the same road out that it had taken in 40 minutes of desert scrub and Ridgeland, the particular relentlessness of terrain that doesn't care about the things that happen to people moving through it. She sat with the document envelope in her lap and watched the compound disappear in the side mirror, and then watched the land move past the window in its long, indifferent way. She opened the envelope when the compound was fully out of sight. The unit brief was 8 pages, classified, formatted with the clean specificity of official documents that know exactly who their audience is and don't waste their time. She read it through once, then twice, then set it flat on her knee and looked out the window. The unit was real. The work was real. The access level and the operational scope and the 6-week entry process, all of it was the actual thing, not a bureaucratic fiction designed to manage her transition. She had suspected as much. Seeing it in writing had a different weight. She thought about what Shaw had said, the ones who know how to exist between missions. She was not sure she knew how to do that. She had known, once. Before the hallway, before the review board, before 18 months of desk work that had been its own form of disappearing. She had known how to live around the edges of the operational life, how to exist in the in-between times, as something more than a function waiting to be activated. She had lost that. She did not know yet how to find it again, and she was going to have to try without a clear manual for the process, which was uncomfortable and which she was going to accept as the actual condition, rather than the temporary state she'd been treating it as. The bus reached the highway interchange and turned north. She put the brief back in the envelope, held it, thought about Lily Way, age 8, who had named her goldfish after her father, and who was growing up in a world where her father had died in a hallway a long way from home, for reasons that a supplemental assessment had correctly identified as systemic failure rather than individual fault, and who would not know or care about that distinction for many years, and possibly never. Mara was going to write the letter. She had decided that in the service corridor, after Shaw walked away, though she hadn't said it. She didn't know yet what the letter would say. She knew it would not explain or justify. It would not perform guilt for consumption. It would say, I was there. I knew your husband. I am still here. You are not carrying this alone. Whether Yuna Wei wanted that letter was something she would find out. The writing of it was not contingent on the wanting. She spent the 6 weeks as Shaw had told her to. Not perfectly. Nothing she did in those 6 weeks was clean or smooth or easily categorized as recovery. She drove to her storage unit and opened the boxes she hadn't opened. In 18 months, the personal items from the last apartment, the operational souvenirs she'd never properly dealt with, a photograph she'd forgotten. She had of herself and Marcus and Chen at a pre-deployment dinner somewhere. All 3 of them squinting into a camera they hadn't asked for. All 3 of them tired, all 3 of them there. She held the photograph for a long time in the storage unit's fluorescent light, and then she put it on the dashboard of her car and drove to a diner and ate an unremarkable meal and sat for an hour with nothing to read and no task to complete. She did that badly. She was not comfortable doing nothing. She compensated by doing the physical work she'd been deferring her hands healed properly, given the week that Torres had prescribed. She ran, not for PT benchmarks, but for the simple reason of moving through space at a pace that matched the speed of her thoughts. She slept more than she had in years, and she was not graceful about it, lying in the unfamiliar quiet of an apartment that wasn't a bunk room and finding the quiet large and strange. She called her sister. That was the hardest phone call. Not because the conversation was difficult, it wasn't. It was 2 hours of the ordinary back and forth of people who know each other and haven't talked in too long, but because it required her to acknowledge that she had gone 18 months without calling. And her sister, who was not cruel and was not unkind, said, I know you disappear when things are hard. I've just been waiting for you to come back. She did not have a good answer to that. She said, I know. I'm working on it. Her sister said, that's all I needed to hear. She wrote the letter to Yuna Wei on the 4th week. She wrote 8 drafts. The first 6 were wrong in different directions, too explanatory, too apologetic, too careful, too raw. The 7th was too short. The 8th was the one she sent. It was 2 pages. It said what she had decided it would say, that she had been there, that she had known Marcus Hale as someone worth knowing, that she was not writing to ask for forgiveness or to offer comfort of a kind that couldn't actually be given, but to say plainly that she thought about Chen and Marcus, that she would continue to, and that she hoped Lily was well. She sent it to the address Shaw's case officer had forwarded through the contact channel, and she did not wait for a response. She had learned enough about herself in the past 3 weeks to know that waiting for a specific response was a way of making the letter about her needs rather than its stated purpose, and she refused that framing. 3 weeks later, a response came. It was 4 sentences. Yuna Wei's handwriting was careful and deliberate, the way you write when you have thought about every word. Agate. The 4 sentences said, Thank you for writing. I have wondered about you. Chen talked about his team as though they were people worth talking about. Lily named her fish captain, which was apparently something Chen called himself when he was being ridiculous. Mara read it, standing at the mailbox. She read it again. She went inside and sat at her kitchen table and put the letter flat and pressed her healed hands. Both of them. The knuckles restored to something close to normal, the new skin still slightly shiny where the deep splits had closed on the surface of the table and breathed. She was not going to stop carrying this. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when she'd arrived at Blackridge. The weight was not going away. She had been waiting for it to go away, and it wasn't going to, and the question had never been how to put it down. It had always been how to carry it in a way that left both hands free. She picked up the letter, put it in the same drawer as the photograph from the pre-deployment dinner. Looked at the photograph for a moment, the three of them, squinting, tired. Closed the drawer. She passed the entry process on the 41st day of the 6-week window. Medical clearance first. The doctor who reviewed her hands noted the impact damage with a clinical interest that she recognized as someone cataloging history rather than predicting outcome. These healed correctly, he said, which was about as much as medical clearances offered in the way of positive assessment. The psychological evaluation was 3 sessions, with a contractor psychologist named Dr. Yi, who asked better questions than Mara had expected, and whose face gave away nothing about the answers, which was appropriate. She answered honestly. Not fully, there were things that weren't in the scope of the evaluation, but honestly within the scope, which was the standard she decided on going in. At the end of the 3rd session, Yi set down her pen and said, "You carry grief appropriately." Mara had looked at her for a moment and said, "I'm working on it." And Yi had said, "That's what appropriately means." The 2nd stage assessment was 3 days in a facility. She was told was in the Pacific Northwest, and which was in an environment sufficiently unlike Blackridge that the comparison itself was instructive. It was less about testing what she could do than about testing how she thought decision trees, information-scarce scenarios, the specific kind of problem that has no clean answer and requires you to make the best available choice and live with it. She found it, to her own moderate surprise, almost straightforward. She had been making best available choice decisions under information-scarce conditions for long enough that the formal evaluation of the skill felt like being assessed on the ability to breathe. The clearance psychologically, professionally. The clearance came through on a Tuesday morning. Shaw's captain sent a 3-line message through the contact channel confirming assignment, effective the following Monday. She sat with that for the rest of Tuesday. Then she packed her duffel. Same one she'd taken to Blackridge. It was still worn in the same places, still had the repair on the left shoulder strap from wherever she'd caught it on something sharp 2 assignments ago. She put the photograph in the duffel. Not tucked away, she put it in the outer pocket, accessible, present. Not a wound to be managed, a fact to be carried. The unit was everything the brief had described, and several things the brief hadn't. The work was precise and difficult. The work was precise and difficult and required her to operate at the full measure of what she was, not the reduced version she'd been maintaining, not the careful, smaller performance she'd been giving the world for 18 months. The full thing, the trained, capable, flawed, grief-carrying, still-standing full thing. She made mistakes, not catastrophic ones, but real ones, the kind that operational environments produce when you're learning a new team's rhythms, a new set of protocols, a new vocabulary of trust that has to be built between people who are going to depend on each other in conditions that don't offer much margin for error. She accepted the mistakes with the matter-of-fact accountability of someone who had learned the difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt was what you carried when you treated failure as evidence of your own inadequacy, and responsibility was what you did when you treated failure as information about what to do differently. She did differently. She learned the team. She learned the work. 6 months into her assignment, the unit ran a mission in a location she was not authorized to name even in private memory. Complex environment, contested with the specific compressed decision window that separates the people who can do this work from the people who think they can. She was the senior field officer on the team. Her call. She made it. The team came back whole. All 4 of them. No casualties. Objective, achieved, exfil clean. The debrief afterward in a room that smelled like bad coffee and felt like the specific collective exhale of people who have done a hard thing and done it right. She sat in that debrief room and looked at her hands. Both of them. The knuckles that had been split and healed and split again and healed properly. The skin that remembered what it had been through and had closed over it. Not perfectly. There were scars. There would always be scars. That was not how damage works, but closed. Functional. Present. The team lead, a woman named Rourke, who had been running operations since before Mara's first deployment and who did not offer praise casually or waste it on things that didn't deserve it, caught Mara's eye across the debrief table. She gave her a single nod, not a performance. Just an acknowledgement between people who speak the same language. Mara nodded back. The guilt was still there. It lived in the drawer with the photograph and the letter from Unaway. It surfaced in the small hours and in the specific moments where success reminded her of the people who hadn't made it to their own version of it. She was not cured of grief, and she was not going to be, and she had stopped wanting to be, because grief in its appropriate form was how the living kept faith with the dead, but did not run her anymore. That was the thing. She ran, and that was different. On the anniversary of the mission that had taken Marcus and Chen, she drove to a park, any park, just the nearest one, and sat on a bench and did nothing useful for an hour. She had started doing this 6 months into her unit assignment, the specific act of doing nothing on that date as a form of acknowledgement that didn't require witnesses or ritual. She sat and thought about them. The specific people Marcus's particular laugh, the way Chen used to go quiet before an op, storing up something she'd never been able to name. She thought about Lily Wei, who was 9 now and wanted to be a marine biologist and had a goldfish named Captain. She thought about Blackridge, about the mining yard and the memorial wall and the 7 hours of sleep she'd had. The night, everything changed. She thought about what she had gone there to find out and what the answer had cost and what she'd done with it since. She sat on the bench until the hour was up. Then she got up, picked up her coffee, and walked back to her car. She had work in the morning. She was going to be ready for it. The people who are hardest to break are not the ones who never felt the weight. They are the ones who kept moving with it and learned slowly, painfully, imperfectly to carry it without letting it decide who they became. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story traveled.